All right, good evening, everyone. It's more or less time to start. Some other people may yet trickle in. I'm Eugene Gholz. I'm a professor at the LBJ School, and I organized this speaker series for the Robert Strauss Center on International Security and Law. It's our international security speaker series where we define security fairly broadly and try to engage contemporary topics of policy relevance and general interest, and try to get a good discussion of I don't know, the important things happening around the world. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's talk. I usually, at this point, flog our next talk in the series, but we're actually, I know it's hard to believe, but coming to the end of the fall semester in just 2 weeks. So there is not a next talk of this fall. The next talk will be at the end of January, and we have a quite full schedule of talks in the spring. I think we may have 7 or something like that, scheduled series of talks that'll be over here. They're not all international security. But so keep your eyes peeled. Go to www.robertstrausscenter.org and see what's on tap. But today, it's my great privilege to introduce Dan Drezner. Dan is one of the leading experts in international policy, particularly areas that have to do with international economics and great power politics, so big think international economic questions. But he's perhaps best known. He's known to me and some other obscure academics for many years as a smart guy and a good author of some important academic articles. But I don't know, rock star status springs to mind in that Dan has a huge public following, unlike the rest of us. DanDrezner.com used to be one of the go-to blogs to understand foreign policy and international affairs, and stuff about the Red Sox. It's now migrated, so when you're a rock star on your own site, people come knocking on your door, and so now he's at foreignpolicy.com, where they have Dan and a stable of several other similar people who interact, and it's actually a great site for kind of being up on really smart, insightful commentary on contemporary international affairs. So go check out Dan's blog there, but just generally, it's a good place to go. But Dan is currently a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts, which is a well-known, well-established competitor of ours, but we don't hold that against him. And we're very grateful that he's come down today to talk about one of the big topics in current international affairs. I'll rephrase it bluntly: should we be scared of China? In particular, scared of the fact that we are deeply in debt to China. So, Dan, please enlighten us about bad debts.
Thank you, Eugene, and thank you, everyone, for coming. What I'm about to say is, in some ways, was published as an article in the fall 2009 issue of International Security. So the bad news is that any holes that you discover in this argument, it's too late. The thing's been published. The good news is that I'm probably not going to stop writing about this, and I'm perfectly willing to concede I'm wrong. So I'm looking forward to your comments. Earlier this week, when Barack Obama visited China, the following paragraph was written in the New York Times. It was kind of stark. This is no longer the United States-China relationship of old, but an encounter between a weakened giant and a comer with a bit of its own swagger. Washington's comparative advantage in past meetings is now diminished, a fact clearly not lost on the Chinese. Not the most subtle of New York Times passages. I think The Daily Show, in fact, even did it better. Jon Stewart, I think 2 days ago, described Barack Obama's visit to Beijing as an opportunity for Barack Obama to visit all the US dollars in Beijing. And as much as this is a joke, it really echoes a lot of much more serious public and policymaker concerns about the strategic and geopolitical implications of U.S. indebtedness to China. In early 2008, the Director of National Intelligence, Michael McConnell, testified saying, there are concerns about the financial capabilities of Russia, China, and OPEC countries, and the potential use of market access to exert financial leverage to achieve political ends, and this represents a major national security issue. His successor, Dennis Blair, in early 2009 said the primary near-term security concern of the United States is the global economic crisis and its geopolitical implications. This gets matched by increasingly what would seem like aggressive Chinese statements about the fact that they do own significant amounts of US dollars and US dollar denominated debt. One particular noteworthy quote, which was said to James Fallows of The Atlantic, implied, perhaps you should be nicer to countries that own $2 trillion worth of your assets. I'm not saying bow, but just be a little nicer. And that's the kind of thing that occasionally casts shivers across the minds of Americans. And the Chinese have also been much more public in terms of objections to various US policies. And by the way, the head of the Chinese central bank proposed that in the long term we should replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So the basic question in the paper and in the talk today is, should we be concerned about this? Is this really a large concern? The answer I'm going to give you is essentially no. That concerns about Chinese financial leverage over the United States are vastly overblown. And that in fact, if we look at this through the lens of thinking about when countries can actually employ financial statecraft, and if we look at the literature on that, there are debates about the utility of economic statecraft, but there is pretty much consensus about the utility of economic and monetary power, and the conditions under which monetary power can actually be used don't fit the Sino-American relationship. I'll explain why in a little bit. In some ways, I think the concerns about Chinese monetary power kind of echo the concerns about Soviet nuclear power, which is the statement nowadays is, the Chinese, if they wanted to, could dump their dollars and cause an absolute collapse in the US dollar and potentially deep six the American economy. To which I think the response is that's absolutely correct. And by the way, if the Soviet Union had decided to launch a first strike of nuclear weapons against the United States, that would have inevitably certainly decimated the US economy even more. But just because countries can do this does not mean it's in their interest to do so. And just as the Soviets were not going to launch a first strike in terms of nuclear weapons, it is not in China's interests to launch, to try to attack or subvert the US economy. John Maynard Keynes perhaps put it best, which is, if you owe China a couple of $1 billion, that's your problem. If you owe China $2 trillion, that's China's problem. So to use the language of security, China's financial power, without question, increases its deterrent capabilities. They are much better placed now to resist US pressure than they have been at any point in their history. That said, they cannot necessarily translate their financial leverage into compellence power. They can't get the US to alter either. So as a result, we basically have a situation very much akin to the Cold War, which is one of mutually assured destruction. So, why is this suddenly a concern now, besides the fact that it's clearly on the Daily Show and therefore must be important? Well, you've had rising macroeconomic imbalances for about the past 10 years in a system that was or a non-system that was dubbed Bretton Woods II. Essentially, this system consisted of China and other Pacific Rim economies keeping their currencies, relatively speaking, undervalued vis-a-vis the dollar, doing so by buying large amounts of dollars and dollar-denominated assets. As a result, for the United States, interest rates were ridiculously low and capital was cheap. This fueled a major consumption binge for the past 10 years until about 18 months ago, which further increased the U.S. current account deficit, which further increased Chinese holdings of dollars. In September 2008, China was estimated to hold approximately $2.3 trillion in the form of actual cash, dollar-denominated assets in the form of either U.S. Treasury debt, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac debt, or long-term equities or commercial paper. The $2.3 trillion is approximately 30% of global currency reserves, suggests the extent to which China has really amassed particular large amounts of holdings. And in 2008, by some estimates, China's purchased roughly half of all U.S. government debt issued. So they've got pretty significant monopsony power. And understandably, there's some concerns about this because if you take a look at Chinese foreign economic policy, it's been very, very clear that China's been willing to subvert what would be considered standard commercial interests in favor of geostrategic interests. China, in the manner of in the pattern investment of its sovereign wealth funds, in the pattern of its foreign aid, has clearly tried to secure long-term holdings over key raw materials that they see as being vital to their economic growth in the long term. And so the argument made by some that are worried about the growth in Chinese reserves is that really the sort of nuclear option that I talked about earlier is actually unnecessary. That all China has to do to exert its leverage is basically clear its throat. Hint perhaps that it will stop buying dollars or US debt at the same rate that it has in the past. This will cause, a frenzy of concern about the dollar and will therefore bring US policymakers to its knees. And this sort of echoes a sort of long series, long intellectual pedigree in which there have been major concerns about countries that have significant amounts of foreign debt. Niccolo Machiavelli, Immanuel Kant, and V.I. Lenin, three philosophers you don't normally hear lumped together, all of which have said in their writings, beware of foreign debt. That's the last thing you want. And nowadays you can comb through the statements during the 2008 presidential campaign. Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden all voiced concerns about rising U.S. debt to China in particular. Hillary Clinton, for example, said, simply put, you can't negotiate with your bankers. And there are historical examples where creditor power has certainly been exerted. Charles II, who was the King of Spain during the 16th century, was brought to his knees in the War of Spanish Succession because Genoese bankers decided that they were not going to loan him any more money, and therefore, as a result, he had to suspend his operations in the Netherlands. In 1956, when Great Britain, France, and Israel decided to occupy the Suez Canal, the United States precipitated a run on the pound sterling and did not allow Great Britain to access its IMF quota, therefore forcing Great Britain to capitulate in that incident. In 1991, the United States suspended or threatened to suspend $3 billion worth of loan guarantees to Israel unless Israel froze their housing settlements, which they did for a very short time in order to get to the Madrid peace talks. You can look at examples of IMF conditionality or the instances from the Financial Action Task Force where anti-money laundering sanctions were imposed, and it seems that capital market sanctions work reasonably well. So, do we have reason to be concerned? And here's where I tell you the answer is no. The fact is that theoretically there have to be an extremely rare combination of circumstances to kick in for financial power to be useful in a sort of geopolitical manner. The first and most important instance is that there have to be no alternative sources of credit. In other words, if China were to actually impose some kind of sanction against the United States would have to be unable to raise funds from any other place, both domestically and foreign. Now, this can happen if a debtor state in particular is an awful credit risk. If a debtor state is a bad credit risk, then it might be that that country, one country is the only one willing to loan in the first place, in which case they do have leverage. Another possibility in which this can happen is if the primary creditor manages to create a cartel. If the primary creditor works in concert with other major creditors, then that again blocks the debtor state from potentially finding alternative sources of credit, and that can make life very difficult for the debtor state. The second thing that has to be the case is, and this is true of any kind of sanction you impose, is that if you impose sanctions, you have to be sure that you can hurt the target much more than the target can hurt you. If the target state has any kind of retaliatory capability, well then suddenly sanctions don't look that attractive. Based on my own work, there have to be low expectations of future conflict, which is if the two sides, if the two countries see themselves as either rivals or adversaries, sanctions don't work terribly well. And the reason is that countries are going to be exceedingly reluctant to make a concession to a country when they anticipate that they're going to have future conflicts down the road and will be in a weakened bargaining position as a result of that, both materially or in a reputational sense. And finally, the best way in which you can exercise monetary power is a situation in which the debtor state or the borrowing country is trying to preserve what would be considered a rigid monetary regime. In particular, if the country is trying to maintain a fixed exchange rate and trying to defend that rate, then they're pretty vulnerable. If, on the other hand, they have a floating rate regime, there's less pressure because they can simply allow market forces to kick in. So, does the Sino-American relationship meet this criteria? It doesn't meet any of this criteria, in fact. The U.S. still holds a AAA rating for the moment, and over the past year it has been able to sell ridiculous amounts of its own debt, even though we're in a financial crisis. in some ways there's a sort of an odd flight to quality paradox that we've seen exposed because of the financial crisis, which is even though the crisis originated in the United States, when you start seeing a flight to quality, the flight to quality was essentially short-term U.S. government debt. And one of the paradoxes is that anytime it looks like the global economy is actually coming out of crisis, that's when the U.S. has to have a higher interest rate in order to finance its issuance of debt. So oddly enough, if the U.S. were to somehow become in a more serious crisis, then money would come back into the United States in terms of buying U.S. debt. So oddly enough, even if things get worse for the United States, they might actually wind up having to pay a lower interest rate in order to finance their debt in the future. The second issue is that China is not going to be able to secure a concert of creditors for a variety of reasons. First, there are a fair number of countries out there that actually fear China a little more than they fear the United States. And more importantly, there are countries that are significant surplus credit capital exporters that have relatively tight security relations with the United States, namely the Gulf Cooperation Council in the Middle East and Japan. Can the U.S. retaliate if China were to exercise this kind of monetary power? And the answer is, well, yes. The passive response by the United States would actually be to do nothing. Because if China were to exercise its monetary power, what inevitably would happen is that the dollar would fall vis-a-vis the yuan, which is fine, except for China at this point, a 10% appreciation in the renminbi, or in the yuan, translates into roughly a 3% of GDP loss, book losses in terms of China's dollar holdings. Now bear in mind, this is in a case where the country is, Chinese population is already irate because CIC invested $3 billion in Blackstone and lost that. We're talking about 3% of trillions of dollars. It's going to be significantly greater losses, and it's not clear that the Chinese leadership would tolerate that. The active response by the United States to this would be simply to deny market access to to Chinese exports. And although China is diversifying its economy, it's still remarkably dependent on exports to the United States in order to fuel its continued economic growth. Are there expectations of future conflict between China and the United States? I think it's safe to say yes. There are repeated disagreements on security, both naval activity in the Pacific Rim, non-proliferation, regional governance, global warming, human rights, trade, I could go on. There's not a shortage of conflict expectations there. And is there a rigid monetary regime? Well, as it turns out, there is, but it's not the United States that's adhering to it, it's China. China, in order to continue amassing dollars, and in order to fuel its export boom, has maintained a relatively strict peg to the dollar since July of 2008. And in the previous 3 years, they'd allowed the yuan to appreciate slightly, but not all that much. So in fact, it's China that's the great power committed to the fixed exchange rate. It's not the United States. And in truth, if you look at the sort of historical examples that I talked about earlier, in most of those cases where you had successful imposition, it was because the debtor state was in such a financially precarious state that they simply couldn't find an alternative creditor. It was a case where it was one ally usually applying pressure against another ally, which is not the case in the Sino-American relationship. And there were significant degrees of multilateral cooperation, either a concert of creditors or an actual multilateral organization in the form of the International Monetary Fund or the Financial Action Task Force. There have been cases, recently where capital market sanctions, and financial powers attempted to be imposed. Both Iran and North Korea right now are under, financial sanctions, and they've certainly bitten those countries. What's interesting, though, is that neither of those countries have given any concessions whatsoever because of the sanctions. In fact, in the North Korea case, you can actually argue it made them more obstinate, not less. In part, again, it's because both of these countries anticipate frequent conflicts with the primary sanctioning country, the United States. So, to give some examples of this, the paper looks at two cases. The first is the regulation of sovereign wealth funds, in which capital exporters did not want to see the imposition of transparency. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about that case, but I'm happy to deal with it in Q&A. Rather, I'd like to talk more specifically about what China did once the financial crisis started in 2008, and the ways in which they tried to exert leverage on the United States and the extent to which they either succeeded or failed. When the crisis broke in early 2008, China was actually pretty clear, in the middle of 2008, China was actually pretty clear about what it wanted in terms of its policy preferences. The first thing they kept repeating over and over was that they wanted to have the US government protect and pledge to protect Chinese dollar assets. Simply put, the Chinese leadership, by hook or by crook, and actually there's evidence that they didn't realize the extent to which they'd made some risky investments. But by the summer of 2008, they held massive amounts of debt in both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They had an increasing amount in the form of securities guaranteed by those two organizations. They had a fair amount of equity in various financial stocks. And they wanted to make sure that the U.S. government would guarantee to protect the value of those assets and would pledge to intervene. The other thing China was obviously worried about was rising protectionism in the United States. They wanted enhanced guarantees of access to U.S. markets. And then as the crisis began to unfold, you also began to hear proclamations by Chinese leaders that they would like to see the Federal Reserve ratchet back its relatively loose monetary policy. The key fear they began to have was of a precipitous rise in Chinese inflation, which would further erode their dollar assets. Now, at the beginning of as the crisis started, you saw the exercise of Chinese financial power, I would say in three different ways. The first is there was a significant sort of flurry of rhetoric by both official leaders, by unofficial advisors to the Chinese central bank, and in the form of sort of People's Daily and China Daily editorials, all calling on the United States to make sure they protected Chinese assets, and implying that if they didn't, there would be trouble. One China Daily editorial explained that the United States should not expect continuous inflows of more cheap foreign capital to fund its one after another massive bailouts. Beginning in the fall of 2008, China began selling off a lot of its Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt. In fact, that was the one period in which they did not accumulate significant amounts of reserves. And then beginning in early 2009, you saw a flurry of activity to make some kind of effort to internationalize the use of the yuan as a way to potentially, in the long term, rival the dollar. This came in the form of approximately $100 billion worth of currency swaps with other countries as a way to promote trade denominated in yuan or renminbi rather than the dollar, and in the form of a whole array of measures to allow bonds to be denominated in renminbi, to allow trade to be cleared in yuan or renminbi. What did they get from this? Well, they got one significant thing, and this should be very clear, which is it's probably the case that they got Henry Paulson and the Treasury Department to agree to put Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into a conservatorship probably about 6 weeks to 3 months earlier than they otherwise would have intended. It's pretty clear that by the time that they actually, by the time the conservatorship decision was announced, Paulson all but acknowledged that foreign pressure was one of the key reasons why they had made the decision, that it was becoming clear that these countries were not going to buy any more debt issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This is also, however, the one case in which China, by applying this pressure, was actually able to act in concert with others, which is China wasn't the only country worried about the state of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Russia was actually also beginning to divest itself of this kind of debt, and Paulson was on the phone every day to members of the GCC in order to reassure them that things were going to be fine. Furthermore, it's not clear whether or not this decision wouldn't have happened anyway. Again, it's more the timing rather than the actual decision, because if you had taken a look at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's finances even in early 2008, you could kind of see the handwriting was on the wall. With regard to the protection of other Chinese holdings, not so much, no. Chinese holdings in Blackstone and Morgan Stanley plummeted just like everyone else who held Blackstone and Morgan Stanley. CIC assets in the Reserve Primary Fund, when that fund broke the buck, were frozen just like every other investor in the Reserve Primary Fund. The State Administration on Foreign Exchange lost hundreds of millions of dollars that they had held by Washington Mutual Bank when the government took over WAMU. There was certainly no ratcheting down of protectionism. There was, if anything, there's been sort of wavering in terms of U.S. rhetoric on the yuan, with Timothy Geithner when he testified saying that China was manipulating its currency. By the way, they are manipulating their currency. This isn't the issue. The issue is whether or not you're allowed to say this in public. Geithner said that then in the first Treasury report that was issued in June, they pretty much adhered to what the Bush administration position was, which is they did not outright accuse them of this, because had they actually outright accused them of this, it forced them to have to go to the IMF. That said, in recent months, the rhetoric on the yuan has gone up, or has become more hostile, if anything. Anti-dumping investigations, particularly focused on Chinese exports, have increased dramatically. They went up by something like 35% in all of 2008. They went up by close to 20% in the first quarter of 2009. And then, of course, we have cases like the Chinese tire case and so forth, which have made headlines. The Federal Reserve in particular has refused to back away from easy money. In fact, in early February of this year, Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister, in his annual press conference, stated explicitly that he was very worried about the holdings of China's holdings of dollars and hoped that they would preserve their value. And it was less than a week after that that the Fed announced that they would actually buy up an additional $300 billion worth of long-term government debt as a way to keep interest rates low and to further boost the U.S. economy. The fact is, when you look at this, China's leverage on these issues has largely been limited for a couple of reasons. First, and probably the most important, is if China doesn't put its excess capital into the United States, it's not clear where else they can put it. You're talking about trillions of dollars worth of capital. Most markets simply can't handle those kinds of capital inflows. The U.S., by having such a relatively deep and liquid capital market, is one of the few that can absorb that kind of inflow. The second problem is that as much as China has tried to make feints towards internationalizing the yuan, they haven't really taken the fundamental step, which is they haven't made the yuan convertible. It's still an inconvertible currency, and if anything, I would argue that the 2008 financial crisis has taught it probably the exact opposite lesson in terms of what to do here, because in the case of China, their opinion is that because their capital market was somewhat segmented from the rest of the world, they were hurt, relatively speaking, not as badly. And furthermore, because the financial sector is so intertwined with the state, they were actually able to push credit expansion relatively quickly once they decided to increase loans, to the point where now you've got concerns about a credit bubble forming in China. Furthermore, if you take a look at the evidence in terms of what actions actually moved both both currency markets and debt markets in the United States, in every case it's U.S. statements and not Chinese statements. It was very rare that you would see a situation where China's would issue a statement that would actually cause the dollar or the interest rate on Treasury debt to move. The two exceptions to that were one where there was an actual statement not by China, but rather by the BRIC finance ministers, period, which again is evidence that you need multilateral cooperation. And usually it's when you have multilateral cooperation that there was effects. I think my favorite example of this actually, though, was when Timothy Geithner was giving a talk to the New York Council on Foreign Relations, and this had come, I think, a week after the president of the People's Bank of China had proposed the sort of future, currency to replace the dollar. Geithner was asked what he thought about the proposal, and I was listening to this phone conversation, and it was very clear that he was saying, we certainly understand China's concerns, but we're not going to be eliminating the dollar anytime soon as the reserve currency. I would say he's phrased it inelegantly, however, and apparently the headline went out over Bloomberg that Geithner said he would consider, the Chinese proposal. While he was doing that, the dollar fell rather, significantly, at least as far as it could within the hour that this was going on, to the point where, in fact, the moderator for the CFR session was actually asked to ask Geithner to re-clarify his remarks, which he then did, and at which point the dollar went back to the status quo. So, in fact, it's U.S. officials that markets seem to be paying attention to much more than China. Now, part of this might be because one of the reasons China is acting this way is that it might actually not so much want to truly pressure the United States to change. I mean, it would like to see the U.S. Adopt these policies, but some of what China might be doing, at least, is for show in the form of trying to placate domestic public opinion, which is there is a tremendous amount in China of blowback from the result of investments in the United States not turning out quite the way the Chinese public thought. And if you think about it, from a political optics situation, China's in a no-win situation because on the one hand they seem to be amassing ever larger amounts of dollars, and on the other hand, China's a ridiculously poor country in some ways. And it's fair to ask, from some members of the Chinese population, why is it that the U.S., that China keeps seeming to hold large amounts of dollars and then invest them in the United States rather than in China proper? I think my favorite quotation, that sort of pretty much sums up crudely what's going on, comes from the director of China's Banking and Regulatory Commission, where he said the following: "Except for U.S. treasuries, what can you hold? Gold? You don't hold Japanese government bonds or British bonds. U.S. treasuries are the safe haven. For everyone, including China, it is the only option. We hate you guys. Once you start issuing $1 trillion or $2 trillion in debt, we know the dollar is going to depreciate. So we hate you guys, but there is nothing much we can do. So with that, I think on the whole, China is not going to be able to use its financial power to compel the United States. Now, hopefully I've made my case, but let me close with a couple of sort of cautions and caveats, because I'm an academic and I do that kind of thing. The first is that there is no doubt that China's increased dollar holdings has allowed it to deter U.S. pressure as well. The fact is that 10 years ago, there is significance. There's a reason the New York Times wrote the paragraph it did, which is 10 years ago, China was, the U.S. was able to bully China a fair amount on human rights. Even 5 years ago, you saw that conversation taking place. It clearly hasn't taken place since the Obama administration has come into power. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in early February, in her visit to China, was pretty blunt in saying that human rights was going to have to take a back seat to larger issues. So there's no question that China has also been able to resist U.S. pressure to a much greater extent than perhaps they could have 10 years ago. Second, Chinese financial power does not necessarily work in coercing the United States, but you can argue that it has worked somewhat with third parties, which is China has sufficient reserves such that they can use their financial power not so much as a stick, but rather as a carrot to buy goodwill in a whole variety of countries that, particularly when the financial crisis started, were starved for capital. So as a result, China was able to throw its dollars around to places like Kazakhstan, Iran, most of sub-Saharan Africa as a way to buy goodwill. And you can argue this is an excellent use, of dollars as a way to advance China's soft power. And then third, with regard to compelling power, towards the United States, I guess I have sort of three concerns whereby I might be proven wrong. The first is that, to quote Larry Summers, what you have right now is a balance of financial terror between China and the United States. Again, much like the security situation you had between the United States and the Soviet Union. The difference is that last I checked, only the president had the option of pressing the nuclear button, and by and large that option was pretty insulated from domestic politics. That is not the case when it comes to economics, and certainly not the case when it comes to international finance. And the fact that you're seeing, for example, increasing erosion, potentially at least, of the independence of the Federal Reserve in the United States, increasing agitation within China about China's dollar holdings, does lead me to wonder what happens if one or the other country winds up becoming a hostage of domestic interests that either don't completely understand or don't quite have the same interest in preserving the status quo ante. In the long term, I have two concerns. One is that this problem goes away, and the other that it doesn't. The problem might not go away because the U.S. macroeconomic situation could deteriorate even further. Pick your favorite CBO projection, and anyway, it's a scary-looking number in terms of the amount of long-term debt that the U.S. is about to amass. And while the U.S. right now has plenty of alternatives when it comes to creditors, if its macroeconomic situation continues to deteriorate, it's going to look more and more like a shaky financial power rather than a relatively robust one, and that's going to be a problem. The opposite concern I have is that actually these imbalances wind down at some point, which is at some point China finally decides they're going to decouple, their dependency on the United States, which, for a lot of people would argue, well, that's great. That means, the imbalances won't go, will slowly wind down. Except as the imbalances wind down, Chinese dependence on the U.S. market will also wind down, which means that it might be more likely and more willing to use its dollar holdings at some point in the future when it's less dependent on the U.S. market to use it in a geostrategic or geopolitical manner. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan. I think there was a lot of detail about U.S.-China and a useful framework for thinking about the economy and coercion. I'm sure there are questions. In fact, I think I'm going to start with one. I'm eager to have questions from the audience and especially from students. Let me say that at the beginning. So think about questions. But I was really struck as you were reading the quote from the People's Daily that they were saying you better stop with the bailouts. But of course, what they're really saying is you better bail us out. Right? We want you to stop with all the bailouts except our bailout, right? And that seems like a slightly different issue to me than just a sort of a simple economic coercion to change our economic policy. It's much more targeted. It's like they don't want, they suddenly want bilateral economic relations rather than a global system. They want to get rid of cross-default clauses, right? They want to say, United States, you just, default on everyone else because it's good for us, and only pay us back. And of course, that violates, lots of typical contracts in, kind of the way when you're lending money, you want to build in the cross-default clause. And so I'm sort of wondering why, I can understand why the Chinese wouldn't want to say it quite that way, but why you didn't want to interpret it that way. I mean, this is just sort of, it's a much more fine-grained, they don't want to wreck the American economy. This isn't a threat to wreck the American economy. It's in fact a protection for the American economy. Like, we'll keep bankrolling you as long as you stop paying the other guy, right? And so, why isn't this a more fine-grained kind of financial coercion?
I mean, you can argue a couple of things here. The first off is that, to be fair, I'm not sure China's position was screw everyone else, just bail us out. I think it would be more, I think it's even subtler than that, which is, I think their position was, we want to be first in line with the bailouts. Because, China's not, naive about this. I think they recognize that if they didn't bail out a lot of these other financial markets, you would have had, a true collapse, which would have, even if China would have gotten bailed out in dollars, they still would have had, significantly less value than they would have been otherwise. So I'm not entirely, I don't think they were being as pernicious, perhaps, let's say, in the sense of, us first, us only. It was more like us first, I would phrase it. The other thing, which I should have said, which I didn't point out, is the reason I focused on, in this case, of how China was trying to use its dollars to get economic policy changes in the United States, was that in some ways that's the easy test. If you would expect China's financial power to matter, on things like, let's say, basing or, naval operations, in some ways the security side should be the harder test. We should expect China's financial power to actually truly matter when we're talking about financial and economic policy. If it doesn't work there, it suggests that it's really not going to work on the military side. I would say one other thing, which is, the other way to think about this is that this might just literally be a learning game, which is China's new at the idea of actually playing, using this financial power card. And I think to some extent, they did, I think a lot of the literature on sort of China's dollar holdings has made it seem like they've done this in a sort of conscious, calculated geopolitical manner, and that's not accurate. I think in a lot of ways they've sort of done this by accident. They did it in large part to keep the yuan undervalued, and one of the side effects of that was holding all these dollars. So in some sense, I don't think they were entirely sure how to play this card. And finally, I'd say one last thing, which is I'm not sure they knew what they want, as much as it was clear to articulate, what they wanted in the abstract, you got to remember, during the confusion of the actual crisis, it's not clear what the right policy was. So, I don't think the Chinese were any less confused than American regulators were at that point.
So is there a student? That looks like a student.
Yeah, these are my nicest clothes. At the risk of sounding like a really obnoxious consultant, I was in China over the summer. And it's because when I was...
By the way, just saying that you were in China over the summer, that's your classic consultant line.
Yeah, so Professor Drezner had a blog post of how do you sound like an obnoxious consultant? Start anything with, so I was in China over the summer. When I was reading this, the implications were the sort of financial gunboat diplomacy doesn't work. Because if China doesn't do it, then nobody could do it, not Russia or anyone else. Mm-hmm. And also, sort of one of the implications here was a William Woolforth-style stability of the unipolar world. China isn't able to basically make the world work according to how it wants. But one of the things you just said a moment ago was, long term, what could be a major problem? What if China decouples? If they're less dependent on the U.S. market, less dependent on U.S. influence, they might use their financial position as a weapon. Mm-hmm. And I want you to sort of draw out the implications of that. Because one of the things when I was there was two things that everyone told me as part of the party line. They had an internal stimulus of $583 billion to boost up domestic demand. And the idea was that with domestic demand in the U.S. going down, they want Chinese people to buy microwaves all the way up to cars, so on and so forth. And the second thing is, they have two major naval building programs. The Blue Blue Water Navy for the neighborhood and the Green Water Navy to protect Chinese shipping. And these were the two things that I could see long-term coming into the decoupling. I mean, could you just sort of talk what you think about that?
Sure. First of all, I don't buy the Woolforth argument about the stability of the unipolar world. This isn't a unipolar world anymore, at least in terms of the financial flows. I mean, I'm trying to be clear, it's a bipolar world. And one of, I think, the things that makes people uncomfortable is that the bipolar world has a lot of stability, but it's a kind of nervous kind of stability. Anyone who has any memory of the Cold War, remembers that on the one hand, everyone looks back at it and says it was stable, but as someone who was a kid during that time, it didn't feel stable. It didn't feel necessarily terribly reassuring. So, I think that's one of the things that's going on. With regard to the decoupling, I'm less worried about sort of China's naval ambitions. I mean, I'm talking about sort of in terms of finance, financial and trade and capital flows. And the question becomes whether or not China really can become much more dependent on its own domestic economy as opposed to being reliant on exports, not just the United States, but general. I think Chinese consumption right now as a percentage of GDP is ridiculously low. It's something like 35%. In contrast, the U.S. consumption as a percentage of GDP is about 70%. What's interesting, though, is that as difficult as it is for Americans to reduce their consumption, and you can actually argue that American savings, because of the crisis, has actually gone from 0 or negative to, I think it's now something like 6%. I won't swear to that, but I think that's roughly what the figure is. China, on the other hand, has had much greater difficulty trying to get its own consumers to buy more. In fact, the latest reports I've seen actually suggest that even if they engage in really significant reforms, their consumption as a percentage of GDP maybe will get up to 50% by 2025. So they're going to be dependent, to some extent. The decoupling thing is a concern I've got if they can pull it off, but I'm actually pretty skeptical that they can pull it off. I think the simple fact is that until China actually gets a proper social safety net in place, and for that matter has to liberalize its financial sector so that individual consumers feel confident with things like credit cards and mortgages, they're still going to save a ridiculously high percentage. And so as a result, I don't think they're going to be able to decouple in quite the same way that they would like to.
Jamie.
Okay. I'm an economist, and
Oh, crap.
and also 14 years ago I was an advisor to the government of China on precisely these issues. I think you're right on your policy.
Sorry.
I think that the reservations that you threw in at the end are probably unnecessary. But I do think that from an analytical point of view, your argument isn't as strong as it should be. And in particular, something that you never said, which distinguishes the U.S. from practically every other case.
Can I guess what you're going to say? Because
you know what it is.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
We're issuing treasury bonds.
Yeah.
This is denominated in the currency over which we have complete control.
Yeah.
There is zero default risk. Right? There is just no chance that the U.S. government will fail to pay the interest it never has and never will on its own, on debt in its own currency. I think also, though, and more fundamentally, you talk in terms of flows, which is truly an archaic way of speaking and I think somewhat misleading. There's no real flow here. If the Chinese chose not to reinvest in U.S. treasuries, what would happen from an operational standpoint? The Federal Reserve would simply debit what's called the securities account and credit the reserve account. Now they would have cash rather than treasuries. It's a computer transaction of absolutely no significance. It's like moving from your savings account to your checking account, except that the bureaucrat would then have to answer questions as to why he was no longer earning the interest that's available on the treasury. Otherwise, utterly no difference at all. The only way they can spend down their balances is by altering their current account, right? Which they have no interest in doing, no reason to do. They are buying all the imports they wish to buy, and they like selling the exports because of a number of things that it brings them materially, including employment opportunities and markets. So it seems to me that the right way to frame this is truly a passive phenomenon. The guy you quoted at the end is exactly right. It's kind of illusory to speak of it in terms of something that could be used one final point, I don't want to speak too long, but on what you said just now about consumption to GDP in China, these numbers are wrong. They're plainly wrong. You can go there and look. It's clear. What is going, or at least they do not indicate a shortage of consumption in China. Consumption in material terms in China has been rising very rapidly. What is problematic here in the statistics is that the pricing that's attributed to consumer goods is that grossly, basically the goods that are transacted in China are much, much cheaper than the same goods sold in export markets, and therefore undervalued in their accounts. In material terms, there's an enormous flow. China's the great producer of consumer goods, and it's an enormous consumer of consumer goods. It is not an export labor camp. It's clear. Let me just go look. It's apparent. And therefore, I would argue that all of this talk about China needing to consume more has really it makes no sense in material terms. It makes no sense. It's an accounting framework issue which was simply not understood on this side of the ocean.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, with regard to the fact that the U.S. issues debt in its own currency and it's not going to default, denominate its own currency, and it's not going to default on that. This is actually one of the things I can thankfully say was in the paper, but not in my talk. So I did mention that, but you're right, I didn't mention it in the talk, and that's an excellent point. On the idea that this is illusory, that it's illusory to talk about this as a strategic weapon, on the one hand, I tend to agree with you, but on the other hand, the reason I wrote this in the first place was I wasn't the one that first brought this up. There's a fair amount of public rhetoric concerned about this exact issue. So, I'm with you on this, but part of the problem is that if enough people in Washington think it can be used as a strategic weapon, then it can be used as, then
They will say and do silly things.
Exactly. So, one of the reasons I wrote...
I'm not contesting the importance
Okay.
of making the case.
Yeah, so I agree with you. And it should be pointed out, at times, not in China's case, but at times capital market, these kinds of things have been used as a strategic weapon. I don't think it's going to be the case now, and I agree with you that there's a much more passive process going on, but, again, partly what I was responding to was this sort of, what sort of the public discourse was on this. On the consumption numbers, I take your point. This is not, part of the problem is I'm only relying on the data I have. I didn't go to China to dig it up, and I think it would be interesting if we got better numbers on this. On the other hand, the numbers I was relying on weren't just from official figures. They were also from actually management consult, things like McKinsey Global Institute. And it's possible they've got it wrong as well, but you think they do as well? Okay. The other thing is whether or not...
I'm saying that it's wrong in money terms. It's just that the real volume of consumption goods in China is much higher than is credited because the price at which things are sold in China
is much lower.
As you can see by going.
No, I take the PPP point. As I say, I take your point, and that's worth looking into some more.
Is it in the border?
Oh, hi. I was wondering about what the development of a dollar carry trade would have on the Chinese sort of financial sector in general. Do you think that would change sort of the balance of how this plays out? Or do you think that it's completely irrelevant to this issue of finance as sort of a strategic weapon?
I think, oddly enough, the one thing a dollar carry trade might actually do, I don't think it's going to affect China. I actually think it'll isolate China potentially. And actually, this goes back to something that Jamie said, which is, the dollar carry trade, the notion is that since U.S. interest rates are ridiculously low, basically that what will happen to the United States is kind of a smaller version of what happened to Iceland, or a larger version, sorry, which is people will borrow large amounts of dollars at next to nothing interest rates and then switch it to a foreign currency, earn higher rates of interest, and that's the carry trade, roughly speaking. I think what you're beginning to see increasingly is not just the United States actually having a problem with the way the yuan is valued vis-a-vis the dollar, but rather, the country, ironically enough, it's not the U.S. that's hurt the most by this, it's Europe. Because as the dollar is falling, so is the yuan vis-a-vis the euro. And so as a result, this actually prices European markets as becoming much less competitive. Somewhat less hurt, but still affected, are the other Pacific Rim exporters. Now, they're a little less hurt because they engage in a lot of triangle trade where they produce stuff, then the intermediate goods get exported to China, and then it gets exported to the United States. But that said, even in those countries, you're starting to see those central banks having to buy dollars when they actually really don't want to. So I think that the sort of growth of a dollar carry trade might actually cause a bunch of countries to line up not with China but against China to suggest that they actually start taking the idea that they revalue the renminbi somewhat seriously. Please.
Oh, I have a question. I think I'm going to fail to force because I only got just a little bit of this, but there was one point that I want to ask.
Mhm.
You said that China wanted us to change our policies.
Mhm.
So could you elaborate a little bit more on what policies? I assume that maybe you meant the Fed, or what policies, you could make it kind of clear and simple.
Sure,
What
I'm sorry.
policies do they want us?
Well, it depends on, beginning with the summer of 2008, China wanted the following policy changes. First, they wanted the U.S. government to guarantee the debt held that was denied, that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae had guaranteed, which is what the United States did. They also wanted the U.S. to try to preserve the value of its other assets held in the United States, namely long-term, equity, stakes in things, companies like Blackstone or Morgan Stanley, and they certainly wanted to be able to get access to those assets. They wanted to make sure that the U.S. trade market was going to, import market was going to stay open to Chinese goods. They were very worried about incipient protection. The number of bills that the Congress would introduce imposing some kind of punishment on China were increasing. Anti-dumping investigations were going up. They wanted secure access, sort of enhanced guarantees. And then as the crisis, became full bore, they became very worried about rising rates of, potentially U.S. inflation. What the Federal Reserve was essentially doing was something called quantitative easing, which is a very fancy way of saying it was printing money and then buying up long-term debt as a result. And what they wanted to make sure was that the Federal Reserve didn't do this so much that the U.S. currency continued to plummet in value. As I said, they got what they wanted on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, although again, they weren't the only ones pressuring the U.S. on this. They didn't really get much of anything on the other issues, which is the Federal Reserve has pretty much done what it's wanted to. And in fact, if you look at the minutes of deliberation for the Federal Reserve, China's never come up in terms of...
There will be some changes with the Federal Reserve. Do you think so?
Do I think there will or should be?
Should be.
No. No. No, I think, in fact, actually, the one thing that I think could actually seriously cause a run on the dollar potentially would be if you actually had a compromise of independence of the Fed. So, no, I'd vigorously oppose.
Well, Ron Paul wants to audit the Federal Reserve. I guess you do that.
Oh, yeah, I know that.
Is that a good idea?
To just pass the banking committee by an overwhelming vote today.
Yeah, that's cheering.
Thank you.
I don't think, let me put it this way, I think the Fed has brought some of this on itself, given the sort of lax degree of regulation that you had prior to the 2008 crisis. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to the notion that you want to have more monitoring of the Fed. I do not want to see, a situation where the Fed feels like it has to adjust its actions because otherwise it fears congressional intrusion. It's pretty clear to me, let me put it this way, I've heard Ron Paul speak, I've testified in front of Ron Paul's committee. I'm not convinced Ron Paul is smarter than Ben Bernanke. In fact, I'm pretty sure he's dumber than him. So I really don't want him in charge, frankly. So no, I'd like the Fed staying independent. Right? Yeah.
Can I just comment on that, as this is another area of mine? The Fed, as a constitutional matter, is not independent of the Congress. It was formed by statute under the provision of the Constitution that delegates to Congress the authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Congress can tell the Federal Reserve what to do. Congress rarely exercises that right, but as a matter of law, constitutional framework, it has that right.
Oh, no, let me be clear. I'm not saying Congress can't do this because legally it's not allowed. I just think as a matter of policy, it's not terribly a great idea.
Ethan.
Yeah, I'd like you to speak a little bit more about the relationship between financial power and hard power. So in other words, let's suppose that China is pursuing some kind of great power strategy. It wants to be the primus inter pares in its neighborhood. It is pursuing a blue water navy, wants to make it costly for the United States Navy in its neighborhood. To what extent can it use its financial power to fulfill those sorts of objectives? And one more technical question for you, and it's just a straightforward question. What is the state of the Chinese tax base? What's the capacity of the Chinese authorities to tax its people, which is kind of the first sinew of financial power, your ability to tax your own people in order to build that?
Jamie, you want to answer the tax question?
It's straightforward. At the provincial and regional, municipal level, they don't need to have a taxing power because they own the land and they earn the ground rent.
Yeah.
Where did they get this idea? An American economist, Henry George, in the late 19th century, spelled it out, and Sun Yat-sen picked it up. So it's a wonderful system, and it's the reason why they have no problem financing the vast infrastructure investments that they
That's
make.
provincial, and municipal, it's not a central.
Oh, when you say macroeconomic control in Beijing, what you mean is, can the state, the central
Right.
government get the resources
Right.
from the provinces? That's the issue that they worry about.
And my understanding is it's actually not always clear if they can.
No, it's certainly not.
Yeah. On the financial power and hard power, I mean, obviously what Chinese financial power can do is grease the wheels. If they want to expand their basing operations, in other words, not just have bases in China proper, but rather actually start setting up, bases in parallel to the U.S. system, they can obviously, much like the U.S. did immediately after World War II, buy off, countries presumably to do that. And it's certainly going to be easier for them to finance naval operations. It's not like it's going to be a real hindrance in terms of their economic policy. So I mean, those are sort of the most obvious manifestations. I think you can also argue potentially in the sort of medium term, China can also, and the currency swap arrangement kind of looks like this. You can kind of engage in more Hirschman-esque actions, is one way to put it, which is if you can actually, without making the yuan convertible, say, hey, why not instead of trading in the dollar, let's trade with the yuan, denominated in yuan, and if then, other countries run a trade surplus with China, well, that's great, they got yuan, but they can't get them out of China, so they're going to have, blocked exchange in China, which will lead them to be even more dependent on the Chinese market. So, I mean, one could certainly imagine those kinds of policies being pursued, but to be fair, that also assumes that the other countries involved aren't going to recognize the potential dangers here. And this is another reason why I'm not terribly convinced about this, which is, as Chinese power grows, it's safe to say, the argument that the Pacific Rim is a more bandwagoning culture, I think, is absurd. That in fact, most of the other countries in the region, the reason ASEAN exists in the first place is in part to balance against, China. So I think as Chinese power grows, you're going to see, if anything, a sort of mild balance, soft balancing, you could argue potentially against China rather than with them.
Do we have any other? Well, please.
I understand on the short term why China wants to peg the currency to the dollar, and even the medium term. But see, over the long term, it seems like they're causing huge instabilities in their banking system and other areas. So what is the thought process? Is there no long-term planning, or why do they want to peg it and not let it appreciate slowly?
In the long term, we're all dead. I mean, to be blunt, most politicians are going to respond to short-term, policy initiatives rather than the long term. I mean, the long term, you're right. There's going to be certainly an awkward transition. This is actually the topic of a different paper I'm writing, which is going to be on sort of the future of the dollar. And the real problem we have here is that we have very little sort of empirical history in terms of switches in reserve currencies. We have, in fact, one. There was a period where the pound sterling, was the primary reserve currency. Then in the 20s and 30s, it kind of went back and forth a little bit between the pound and the dollar, and now it's the dollar. For China to actually be in a situation where you see the reserve currency not being the dollar anymore, the other alternatives aren't terribly appealing. If you take a look at the future, the euro is the most obvious viable competitor, except you've got the paradox of the euro being produced by a relatively stagnant economic region, and the most dynamic economic region is, if anything, the Asia-Pacific region has much more influence over the dollar than they do over the euro. So it seems hard to believe that they would back a switch to the euro. The other candidate currencies, the yen, the pound, they're all too small. They can't handle this. The renminbi is the obvious alternative, but it's not convertible. So trying to make it convertible will be the sort of long-term program. And I think you can argue that in the long term they are going to try to do this. Except again, the short-term lessons they've taken from this crisis is the last thing they want to do is liberalize their financial sector. But of course, the only way they're going to be able to have, the reserve currency is if they liberalize their financial sector. So that's going to take place under a slow, long period of The only other option, which is what the Chinese initially proposed, was basically a variation on John Maynard Keynes' Bancor scheme, which was try to create sort of a super sovereign currency modeled after the special drawing rights. I think there is no chance in hell of that happening. I don't think markets would put that much faith into it, and the amount of bargaining that would take place over the extent to which you would properly weight the basket of currencies you want to come up with would be an incredibly contentious series of negotiations, and I don't think one in which there's a bargaining court.
Another, Kate.
I was actually wondering if you could elaborate on one of the caveats you gave at the end of your paper, which is something about China not being able to exercise direct imperial power, but is able to exercise indirect power by purchasing influence, buying goodwill abroad. Now, there are a couple of things here I want to push you on, is whether or not you believe sort of some of the current paranoia about Chinese aid in countries like Africa, whether or not it's actually displacing U.S. influence and causing a shift in the balance of power in that region. And secondly, you haven't addressed sort of creeping influence of China in multilateral and regional institutions, as even if the real economic threat is not there, the perception of rising Chinese economic power has led to some discernible shifts in terms of the way multilateral institutions are being restructured.
In terms of whether or not sort of rising Chinese financial power has weakened the U.S., let's say in Africa, I think the answer is yes. Not necessarily, but let's be clear. I don't think Chinese financial power, as deployed in Africa, has been an unalloyed good for China. They've suffered a fair amount of blowback from some of their foreign direct investment, and much like the Japanese suffered when they first came to the United States, and much like the Americans suffered when they first went elsewhere. And part of this is it really is a learning curve issue. But I mean, if you take a look at things like, Neary Woods, I think, has written some good stuff on this, showing that in fact, as Chinese aid is increased to these countries, the ability of the World Bank and other multilateral development banks to attach conditionality to their loans has eroded pretty badly. Not surprisingly, because a country like Angola, if it has to choose between a World Bank loan where conditions are attached versus a Chinese loan where it's not, well, I can't blame Angola for doing that. So I do think it's definitely eroded, U.S. and/or Western influence via the World Bank because you've had these other provisions. In terms of the rising power in multilateral institutions, I mean, in some sense, that's just inevitable. I mean, regardless of what you think of Chinese financial power, the Chinese economy is growing by leaps and bounds. It's thoroughly appropriate, for China to, in some ways, to have a greater, amount of say in a lot of these multilateral institutions. And generally speaking, multilateral institutions where the balance of power within those organizations don't match what actually looks like the balance of power outside those organizations don't last that long. So in some ways, this is kind of something that's necessary to be done. But you're right that as a result of this, China's got more veto power within these organizations. I mean, for example, China was able to veto an Asian Development Bank loan to India because India wanted to, among other things, fund development in a border region that's a disputed region with China. China was also able, essentially for the last couple of years, to veto any serious IMF investigation into the source of macroeconomic imbalances. But I'm not sure that's not perception about Chinese power working. That's actually Chinese power working. It's just not, power translated strictly on the financial level. It's just the fact that they're a rising economic power.
Do you have a question over here? Yeah.
I have just two quick questions. I was wondering about the number on dollar assets. You said it was 2.3 trillion, but today I was talking to a student who said in his class that the answer was 500 billion, which is a big difference.
Not a chance in hell.
Yeah, so it is around the 2 trillion level.
Yeah.
Okay. And my other question was about what the American public is supposed to do about this. Like, there's a fear. Some people are fearful of Chinese products, let's say toys or poisonous milk powder, and then there's China has the Congress maybe upping the protectionism rhetoric, but then you have people like Warren Buffett saying you should buy American, but then the Chinese products are pretty cheap. So I don't know, what do you think the American public how they should react to this?
Okay, first, on the 500 billion figure, it's possible that what that figure, what your professor, what your fellow student was talking about was actual publicly reported holdings of, let's say, Chinese holdings on treasury debt. I mean, there's a number of different ways you can get at this. It's still not enough, I agree, although maybe last year would have been enough. But I mean, the point is, if you count up everything, you're talking about over 2 trillion. As to what should Americans do, I think the thing to do is not worry about what China's doing. I think the thing to worry is about what the American political establishment is doing. If you seriously want, to not worry about this anymore, you want the U.S. to get its macroeconomic house in order, which means you want, some kind of, stable plan for reducing U.S. government, deficits without choking off economic growth. Now, obviously, there's a fair amount of contestation over exactly how you do that. But what I think you want is for the U.S. political system to be operating in a little more effective manner than it is now.
So I want to push on this a little bit and maybe go back to some earlier issues. Jamie said the U.S. is never going to default. We've issued this, our debt is in our own currency, and so there's no risk of actual default, but we can make dollars worth less and pay back in dollars that are worth less, which is practically speaking the equivalent. It's what we will do. It's what we have done in the past. And so, why is it bad for the United States? Like, what would be your story of why it's bad for the United States to think this way? You say, get our own fiscal house in order, but, the world has given us a whole lot of stuff that we wouldn't otherwise have. They gave it to us, we've got it. We could tell them, come and get it back if you can. But they can't. And they're begging us now, please pay us in the future for the stuff we gave you yesterday. Right? That's your thing. If, they hold all our debt, at some point, why not pay them less than they're asking? What's the, get our fiscal house in order? When people say that, they usually mean let's pay back some of this debt. But
no, that's not
right. But or stop borrowing so much. But isn't borrowing great?
All right, A, you're officially scaring the crap out of me. But B, borrowing can be great. It depends on what you spend with the borrowed money. There's nothing inherently good or bad about borrowing. The question is, from borrowing, are you then investing in activities that wind up, increasing productivity over time or increasing, or is it, sort of expedient consumption?
If you want to pay it back.
Yeah, but Jamie's right. If the U.S. defaults on its debt, then really Chinese monetary power is the last thing we need to worry about. That's the time where you want to go long on duct tape and shotguns. So that's not the issue that you really want to concern about. What you're talking about is, would it be in U.S. interest to moderately allow the dollar to depreciate in value as a way to, moderately decrease the extent to which the U.S. pays back its debts? I think the answer to that is that's what we're doing.
Yeah, it's what we did in the 80s to Japan.
Yeah, and I don't have a disagreement with that. And I think even let me this way: when someone like Ken Rogoff, who's a pretty, orthodox macroeconomist, starts saying things like maybe we should have a little bit more inflation as a way to deal with this kind of situation, then I think you have a measure of truth to that. The tricky thing is that you want a little bit of this, but you don't want so much that you actually really do have a run on the dollar, because then you're in scenarios that I don't even want to contemplate.
Do you have the data on the structure of the treasury holdings of China?
In terms of
the maturities, the tips as a percentage?
Yeah, they've shifted. Well, it's not so much they've shifted. They're big fans of the tips. What the key thing they've done is they've shifted from what they used to hold as much longer term debt securities, 10 years or more. They're now in much shorter T-bills.
So is everybody.
What?
So is everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So, but in terms of the percentage that are tips, no, I don't know off the top of my head.
Right.
So I want to follow up on, I agree with Eugene on this. Shockingly, I find myself agreeing with Eugene more than I'm ever comfortable with.
It should be a warning, Frank.
I should worry about it. But, clearly this is not a bad deal for us, right? It never has been a bad deal for us. We're getting this incredibly cheap financing to do things to buy lots of things because China's making a variety of decisions about its macroeconomy. And one can argue how far you want to go with it. But what I want to ask is about the politics of it. And I think your point about being concerned about people in the higher echelons of policy making a mess of this is an important one. Eugene and I talked a little
little bit about this in the whole Siemens affair, which to my
Yeah.
mind, anyone, China wants to buy a really bad American asset, really bad oil, and overpay for it. By all means, encourage them to do it, right? Just like the Japanese made a variety of not so profitable investments in the 80s, which didn't work out so well. That's, it's not really my problem. I'm actually somewhat happy about that. And it strikes me, a lot of these investments, even in Africa, China wants to make a lot of really stupid investments.
Oh, they're paying like 3 or 4 times market value. Yeah,
And
yeah.
part of the reason they're going for a lot of these natural resources, they're going in places because they can't get access to any others, so they have to overpay for things that ultimately probably aren't going to pan out. So I'm all for China doing this, and we should encourage this, and this is all good. But I don't think people, when I hear statements from the Treasury Department about saying, well, China should revalue, they should let it go up, I can't figure out how much of this is everybody's winking and nodding and saying, this is actually, the situation we have now is good, we don't want to mess around with it, and how much of it is a concern about tampering domestic political sources for protectionism, and how much is really, they just don't really understand what a good deal is. I mean, all your stuff about the reserve currency, you can find 10 articles a year in the last 4 years saying the U.S. is not going to be the reserve currency, right? And it never goes below 59%, it never goes above 80%. It always stays the same. Just, as you say, it's not going to happen, right? Yet, you can always get a good foreign affairs article in 90, find one in 94, one in 88, it's saying, we're not going to be the reserve currency anymore. And I guess what I would want to understand from your perspective is the politics of it, why people see things this way.
Oh. Well, I mean, there's a couple of reasons why I think people see this politically this way. The first is that obviously, rising protectionism gets correlated pretty strongly with large trade deficits. Now, I'm not saying the two are related. It's not like if you increase protectionism, you're going to improve the deficit. That's obviously not the case. But when you have exploding current account deficits, you automatically then have rising protectionism. It's sort of one of the things to follow on. You can actually make the case, to be fair, that on terms of manipulating its currency, China really is costing America some jobs at this point, which is by having the yuan so undervalued, yes, we're getting a lot of cheap stuff. We're also having a lot of factories that otherwise could have made the stuff in the United States going under. And that might be a genuine source of concern. The question becomes, is the reason China getting this stuff because they're actually better at making it, or is it because they're manipulating with the currency? Now, I'm pretty outspoken in not supporting protectionism, but again, my concern is that these pressures eventually, start to build up. And again, there's another reason for this, and I apologize for saying this, but the fact is, there's a fair amount of the Washington establishment that has no friggin' clue what's going on when it comes to foreign economic policy. And they don't understand, two things. They don't understand the economics of it, and they also don't understand the relationship between the economics and the foreign policy of it. So, I had to testify last year about sovereign wealth funds. And I'm doing this in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I'm basically telling them, don't worry, because this is actually one of the rare moments where the Senate acted in advance of what was going to be a policy problem. So what they passed in 2007, they didn't need to do anything else. And Jim Webb, Senator, at this point was considered a vice presidential candidate, starts coming up to me and saying, yeah, why doesn't the U.S. government, start buying its own stock? Why don't we do that? And I said, because governments historically have a lousy track record when it comes to, picking winners in equity markets. And we went back and forth on this for a good while. And I was getting pretty angry, actually, and so was he. But the scary thing is he really believes that, in fact, governments can do this. So I think you've got a lot of perceptions in terms of what governments can do that are flatly wrong. And another related problem, I think, is that a lot of, on the foreign policy side of things, they don't see the economics of this as really being, terribly important. Whereas if you go to the Asia Pacific, to them, things like trade policy are foreign policy. So it's problematic, for example, that, most of the countries in the region are signing FTAs with each other, and yet we can't get, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement passed remotely. So, I mean, partly it's I feel reluctant to say it's the culture of Washington because that's such an easy answer, but there might be a grain of truth to it.
What about Wall Street?
Mm-hmm.
You're not mentioning Wall Street.
What about Wall Street?
Well, I don't think they're doing a very good job did a bad thing by what they did, because they weren't regulated. And they were doing it in the middle of the night.
Actually, I'd argue they were doing it in the middle of the day. It was just that no one was paying attention.
I heard Bill Graham stay up pretty late doing it.
You know, you can argue. Let me put it this way. You know, I don't want to defend, you know, the activities of, you know, the activities that led to the financial crash last year. That said, first of all, it doesn't have anything to do, I mean, it only indirectly has to do with the US-China relationship. I mean, the reason that they were able to do a lot of this stuff is the capital stayed ridiculously cheap in the United States, and that fueled an asset, you know, market boom in the United States. But it's worth pointing out, actually, that, you know, you can argue the ones that actually got snookered the most were, in fact, foreign investors. One of the ironies about this is that as bad as U.S. banks have been, you know, made by this, if you actually take a look at the exposure of, let's say, European banks and other banks, they're in much worse straits. And those countries are, you know, in some ways even better regulated. Europe has got much, you know, the European leverage on this has been worse than U.S. banks' leverage.
I don't think that's a true statement.
I think it is a true
Well,
statement.
it doesn't matter, we all
It's
lost.
enormous.
A bunch of us lost, no matter whether they were worse or better than us, we all lost.
Yeah, but on the other hand, how to put this? Let me put it this way. I'm not going to disagree that there was lax regulation. On the other hand, it is very easy with hindsight to point back and say, you know, we should have been watching more closely what was going on here. One of the problems with asset market bubbles is that they have very weird political dynamics, which is it's very easy, after the bubble to say we were in a bubble. It's a lot tougher, you know, during the bubble to say, hey, we're in a bubble, we should really clamp down right now. Because usually that means that people who are holding all these assets, you know, are going to see them decline in value anyway, and they don't want to see that happen. So as easy as it is to say now that we should have gone back and done things differently 3 or 4 years ago, I guarantee you that the people who suggested that we should have done things differently 3 or 4 years ago would never have had the political juice to actually get anything done, because asset prices seem to be rising, you know, year on year, and therefore why rock the boat? This is, you know, the nature of capitalism. These things happen, which is a terribly unsympathetic message, I know, and not terribly comforting, but that's the way it works.
I'll try to question. Robert.
Yes, Dr. Drezner, I'm just curious on, you talk about, I guess, lack of a better term, paranoia concerning China's absorption of our debt. Does this paranoia in the United States of China play into China's advantage? For example, they can, I guess, have a psychological advantage on trying to kowtow American policy, or does it make it or is it a disadvantage to China, or could they use it, or could they use our paranoia to their advantage or exploit it at all? And do you actually see, I guess, a light at the end of the tunnel from your perspective? Do you see like a light at the end of the tunnel as far as our concerns of China's debt? Would you say, like, be publicly, do you see a time at which we will be, or you will be publicly vindicated? I'm just on a more perception reality, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm laughing when you asked whether or not China can exploit this paranoia, because I keep thinking of some old Twilight Zone episode where, you know, the aliens land and they try to get the villagers to turn on each other.
30 miles east, that's exactly what they think.
Okay. Do I think it plays into China's advantage? No. If anything, it makes their life much more difficult, because the more that, you know, Americans see China as this all-powerful, you know, boogeyman, the more likely that we're going to do some really stupid things that hurt us but also hurt China. So, no, I don't. You know, the last thing they want. You know, as much as it might seem like, you know, you want to seem like an all-knowing, omnipotent power, you know, that's not China. And so I don't think they want that kind of misperception. Do I see a light at the end of the tunnel where I'm vindicated?
I mean, or just the idea that, that this debt is just not going to be a threat to us.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in some ways, if you see the U.S., you know, back at robust economic growth, you know, with reasonable current account balances to the point where, you know, our debt as a percentage of GDP, you know, stabilizes at roughly 50%. and the current account looks relatively manageable, then yeah, I'll feel pretty happy. I'd like a pony too if we're going to be going in that direction.
I actually think that was a great summary and exit, because it was the prognostication of how things might turn out rosy, and I want them to turn out rosy. I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank again at the end of the semester our co-sponsors, the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law and the LBJ Presidential Library. This is a great series, and well, I enjoy doing it. You guys might not think it's great, but at least you showed up. And I hope it will. I look forward to it continuing in the spring. I hope you'll all come back. So I'd like you now to join me in thanking Dan Drezner for his presentation.